Now we are on the fourth and final step in creating the production cost report. We're going to assign costs to completed and transferred out units and to units in process. For our T account, we've already figured out the number of units completed and transferred out and the number of incomplete units still in process at the end of the period. But to do the journal entries, we need the dollar amounts of the costs, not quantity of units. Remember, the main goal of the production cost report is to take the costs that were associated with the beginning work in process units, plus additional costs associated with the units that were started this period. The costs are direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead, and split them between the completed units, which were transferred out, and the incomplete units that are still in the process at the beginning of the period. So the production cost report requires a lot of calculations to determine the cost for the completed and transferred out units and the ending work in process units. As mentioned before, the assembly department is the first process. Therefore, there can be no transferred in units or costs from a previous process. So for this column, we insert not applicable. Next, we move on to the direct materials column. To calculate the direct material costs associated with the completed and transferred out units, we simply take the 40,000 equivalent units of production for direct materials and multiply by the $2.80 cost per equivalent unit. Here's the calculation. The result of $112,000 is the direct materials cost associated with the units that were completed and transferred out of the assembly department. To calculate the direct materials cost associated with the ending work in process units, we simply take the 10,000 equivalent units of production for direct materials and multiply by the $2.88 cost per equivalent unit. Here's the calculation. The result of $28,000 is the direct materials cost associated with the units that are incomplete and still in ending work in process inventory for the assembly department. This gives us a total of $140,000 of direct materials that have been accounted for. Obviously, this is obtained by adding $112,000 to $28,000. To check your work, make sure the direct materials cost to account for is the same amount as the direct materials cost accounted for. They must be the same. Next, we move on to the conversion costs column. To calculate the conversion costs associated with the completed and transferred out units, we simply take the 40,000 equivalent units of production for conversion costs and multiply by the $1.60 cost per equivalent unit. Here's the calculation. The result of $64,000 is the conversion costs associated with the units that were completed and transferred out of the assembly department. Remember, conversion costs are direct labor plus manufacturing overhead. To calculate the conversion costs associated with the ending work in process units, we simply take the 2,500 equivalent units of production for conversion costs and multiply by the $1.60 cost per equivalent unit. Here's the calculation. The result of $4,000 is the conversion costs associated with the units that are incomplete and still in ending work in process inventory for the assembly department. This gives us a total of $68,000 of conversion costs that have been accounted for. To check your work, make sure the conversion costs to account for is the same amount as the conversion costs accounted for. They must be the same. Now we can finish the production cost report for the assembly department. The only thing we have left is the total costs column. This will just involve basic arithmetic. To calculate the total costs for completed and transferred out units, we simply add the transferred in costs, direct materials, and conversion costs to arrive at $176,000. To calculate the total cost for the ending work in process units, we once again add the transferred in costs, direct materials, and conversion costs, with the result being $32,000. Then, to calculate the total cost accounted for, we can either add $176,000 plus $32,000 to get the $208,000 of total costs accounted for, or we can use the previous method and add the transferred in costs, direct materials, and conversion costs to arrive at the same $208,000. As a final check of your work, make sure the total cost to account for is the same amount as the total cost accounted for. They must be the same. So finally, we know how much cost to assign to the units transferred out because they are completed for this process, and units still in process. These are incomplete for this process. First, for the 40,000 puzzles completed and transferred out, we now know they cost us $176,000. Later, this number will be a credit in a journal entry to show how much was transferred out of this account. And for the 10,000 incomplete puzzles still in the process at the end of the accounting period, they cost $32,000. So the production cost report was a lot of calculations to obtain these two numbers. Of course, the calculations could be calculated much more efficiently using Excel, but you need to know specifically how all the calculations work if we were to set it up in Excel.